My name is Peter Young, and I'm a member of the Committee 100, and I'm chair of this Committee 100 Asian American Career Ceilings Initiative. And I want to welcome you to what I think is it's a wonderful panel and a wonderful topic on running for office. I'm going to speak briefly before I introduce Gary Locke, who is the chair of the Committee 100, to make some welcoming comments. But just briefly, this is a program that started in February of 2020 because there was a strong feeling that as successful as Asian Americans have been getting into good schools and rising up in the middle ranks, that pretty much in every profession, Asian Americans have difficulty getting beyond the middle ranks. And so we've had a whole series of events and webcasts of experts who examine the problem and show the data, people who have in different professions and explain what it's like in that particular profession, and millennials who were a panel of millennials who talked about what it looked like from the perspective of millennials. And I hope this has been very, very helpful to those of you who are trying to manage your own careers and be successful. But this one has a special meaning for me because I strongly believe that Asian Americans should have a greater participation in the political arena, whether it's running for office or appointed officer or supporting people who are running for office. So this is a very important one. So let me do this before I introduce our panelists and conduct the fireside chat. Let me turn it over to Gary Locke, who needs no introduction because he's well known by everyone. He was the governor of the state of Washington. He was the Secretary of Commerce, and he was the ambassador to China. So can't pick someone who has had more of an influence and more of an impact on this country and as an Asian American. So Gary, let me turn it over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Peter. And it's really great all that you're doing in terms of these career initiative podcasts with such distinguished speakers. And you're right, there seems to be a glass ceiling in so many of our professions. And Asian Americans, Chinese Americans have given their blood, sweat, and tears for this country. Except for the Native Americans, we're all foreigners. And we've had wave after wave of newcomers and foreigners coming to this country. Whether we're first generation or 10th generation, whether our ancestors came on the Mayflower, a slave vessel, or a steamer from Asia. It's been that constant infusion of ideas and creativity, cultures, language, religions that has really fueled the dynamism, the energy, the innovation that is America. But like so many groups, Asian Americans have faced hardship and continue to face hardship. And I think the rise in the tension between the United States and China is exacerbating that with all the incidents of anti-Asian hate, the Kung flu virus, the Wuhan virus, the China virus, and just the notion that Asian Americans are perpetual foreigners, which is why it's so important that if we care about the issues affecting our communities, whether it's public safety, whether it's job creation, whether it's the environment, whether it's safe communities, whether it's education, Asian Americans need to be at the table, help setting the policies that affect all of us, especially since we have given our blood, sweat, and tears for this country. We have every right and indeed a responsibility to be at the table, setting the policies that affect all of us. And I think, quite frankly, given our culture, our immigrant experiences, we bring a different lens to the table. And it's that diversity of thought that it really makes our economy so vibrant. Makes that diversity of thought makes college discussion and debate and analysis so much more vibrant. And the same thing in the political arena. Those different perspectives can actually improve the quality of the policies and the legislation and the rules and procedures that are being promulgated and being considered. That's why, for instance, you have lobbyists representing senior citizens and all different walks of life as they look at legislation to say, hey, do you realize that it's going to impact my constituents, my interest groups, perhaps in a way that you never thought of? And so having Asian Americans at the table, bringing those perspectives can improve the quality of policies coming out of city councils, school boards, state legislatures, and certainly the United States Congress. And when you look at the huge population, the concentrations of Asian Americans in various communities and various states, San Francisco has done a great job of electing Asian Americans to the city council. But you look at the population of New York or New York City. You look at other population centers all across America with large concentrations, large numbers of AAPI. I don't think we can say that our numbers in those political positions reflect the population. My advice to folks is that please get involved. Consider running for office. And it doesn't have to be for Congress. It doesn't have to be like for Attorney General of Connecticut or something like that, but it can be on the school board. It can be on the city council. And a lot of these positions are part-time, and that will expose people to the opportunities ahead. And quite frankly, you don't need specialized training or a degree from a college or university. All that's required is care, commitment, interest, dedication to the policies of your own community and your constituent groups. And so, in fact, having that background of whether you're engineer, author, dancer, writer, accountant, educator, lawyer, it can be very, very helpful. And so I really encourage people to consider running for office and being involved in government, even on a board or a commission, lending your voice, lending your thoughts, lending your perspectives on behalf of the AAPI community within your own communities. So with that, I hope that listening to our great speakers and with the stimulating questions from Peter, you'll understand that it's pretty easy to run for office, quite frankly. It doesn't require the backing of a huge political machine. You can come out of left field as an independent or a person who has never been involved in politics, and you can win, because I came out of nowhere, had no background, had no involvement in party politics before I ran for the state legislature, and then ultimately the elected administrative officer for the metropolitan Seattle area, and then ultimately governor of the state of Washington. And I want to just say that without the support of AAPIs all across the United States who didn't even know me, but took a chance on me, and the voters in my district took a chance on me, I am eternally grateful for the support of the Asian American community from throughout the United States. And everything I've tried to do was to make all of you proud, to establish myself as a credible, respected public official in order to make it, to inspire others to run for office. And if I did a good enough job, to make it easier for all candidates to actually win those offices. So good luck to all of you, and enjoy the podcast. And I'll turn off my camera and sit back and listen.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Gary. And by the way, for those, I think most of you know about the Committee 100, but for those who don't, it was formed 33 years ago by a number of very prominent people, IMPA, Yo-Yo Ma, and Oscar Tang, and Henry Tang, for two missions. One, the domestic side, which is to help Chinese Americans succeed in a positive, but also in a defensive way, but also to help improve in a nonpartisan way U.S. and China relations. And clearly this program is part of the domestic mission. Before I start, I'd also want to give a special thanks for Henry Tang. Henry Tang is one of the founders of Committee 100, and he helped me recruit Allan, Fung, and I guess I understand I should call it General Tong, right, as the Attorney General, to be panelists for this. And I want to point out one thing that is in common for all three of the people, including Gary Locke as a third, is that these are not people who ran for office in areas where there were high concentrations of Asian Americans. So it makes it particularly interesting that they were successful in being elected in places where it wasn't because there was a lot of Asian Americans, which is a very important point. We also are bipartisan, so not counting Gary, we have one Democrat and one Republican. We decide we don't want to appear to be too skewed one way or the other. So before I start, I just want to say Allan Fung was the mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island for 12 years, I guess it is, and only stop because he termed out. But he is now running for Congress, so we want all of you to support him. General Tong is the Attorney General of Connecticut and has had a terrific career in personal career in the political arena. So we're very, very pleased. He's not running for anything currently because he is Attorney General, so he doesn't have to run. But
just re-election.
Just re-election at some point, which I'm sure will be a piece of cake. So let's start by, I'd like to start out and just ask each of you, our two panelists, just take a few minutes and say, how did you decide to run for office initially, right? Because you weren't all born, in politics. So at some point you made the decision to do that. So maybe if each of you, and maybe we'll start arbitrarily with you, Allan.
Sure. First of all, I do want to thank Committee for 100 for having not only this forum, but many of the forums to help, many individuals break through that bamboo ceiling. I also want to take a moment to thank Ambassador Governor Locke, for all that he's done, because he really was a trailblazer for many of us that really saw him as a role model, doing what he did, leading at a time where there wasn't many of us out in public service like he did. So, we owe a lot to, Gary for what he has done, albeit on the West Coast. But for me, I was a similar story to William, because William and I have done many of these panels, up and down the East Coast, all over the place. But we share a similar type background. I'm first generation born in this country, where my parents came over from Hong Kong back in 1969. They went the Chinese restaurant route. I grew up in that restaurant. And the biggest thing that they stressed to me wasn't getting involved in politics. It was education. I grew up working in that restaurant, learning about hard work, the ethics, what it takes to run a small business, but ultimately, chose a career path of law and wanted to get involved. I studied political science in college as a pathway to law school, but I really enjoyed politics in a sense that I was always helping friends that ran for office back in the day, volunteering on campaigns, door knocking, phone banking, and really enjoyed that. But my goal at that time was to be a lawyer and help people advocate for many individuals as that lawyer. I kind of fell into politics back in early 2000, because while I was part of a law practice, doing what I was doing, enjoying, the career that I was building upon myself, Cranston, a city which was home to my family, home to my family's restaurant for 35 years during the height of the economy, was really, really in dire financial shape. It had the dubious distinction of being in junk bond status with the worst bond rating of any city in the country. And when I started taking a look at what was going on, attending meetings, looking at the budget, I started to get angry with some of the people that I even helped get elected, and wondering how they could make some of these decisions that they were making. So I made that personal decision. I was either going to sit back and just, complain about it or get involved. And I decided at that time, as the governor noted, you can get involved by running for office. And I did for a seat on the city council, and, won that seat that first time, a citywide seat, and no regrets, because it's led to the career that I had, where 12 years as mayor, we really improved the city's bond rating to its height, did a lot of dramatic reforms to the pension system to help, stabilize it, but most importantly, turn it from that fiscal distress into one of the top 50 cities to live in America for 3 straight years. And that was just out of that motivation for anger. So not everyone gets involved, as the governor was saying, and you have different paths to move up, but that's how I kind of got involved. There was a little bit of motivation of anger, but anger against some of the people that I supported. But, I have got no regrets and loved every minute of turning the city around.
That's fantastic. So, General, your story.
Thank you, Peter. You can be sure my mom doesn't call me that. But it's great to,
you should.
It's great to be with you, and thank you, Henry, for helping to recruit me and Allan to join today's panel, and thank you, C100. for hosting this important discussion. It's great to be with my longtime friend, Allan Fung. We met at a training, 10, 15 years ago in Washington, D.C. And Governor Locke has been a mentor to all of us, including me. He's been gracious with his advice over the years. When I considered running for federal office many years ago, he sat with me and gave me a lot of great advice and guidance. So we wouldn't be here without Gary and his mentorship and his guidance. And we wouldn't be here without each other, honestly. Allan's been a great support, and I hope I have been to him as well. So Allan and I largely come from the same place, almost exactly the same place, Chinese restaurants in New England. My parents came here separately. They met in Bloomfield, Connecticut, in a Chinese restaurant called the Hong Kong Kitchen. And they got together, got married, they opened their own place. And our experience is largely in the same time frame. I grew up working side by side with my parents in our Chinese restaurant. And as I got older, 6th grade, 7th grade, 8th grade, I was working there nights and weekends. My parents were there 7 days a week, 15 hours a day. So many people on this Zoom know this story. They know this experience. I like to joke to my Chinese friends that I can probably cook most things on a standard Chinese restaurant menu with a blindfold on. And maybe someday, Allan, you and I can see if we can still do it. But a lot happened in that kitchen, in that restaurant. And for me, being the son of immigrants, first generation, being the first American in my family, my parents did not become citizens until after I was born. There's obviously a feeling of being out of place, a feeling that you don't belong, but it's really, you really feel it when you're in the kitchen on a Friday night. And I remember packing takeout orders, ladling the wonton soup into containers and packing the duck sauce and the soy sauce and the fortune cookies. And I would walk by this door that had a diamond window in it. And I would walk by it 100 times a night. And that door was the door in and out of the kitchen. And I would look through that window and you could see in the dining room all the people that were enjoying, Friday night dinner at my parents' place. But we in the kitchen were invisible to them, right? I mean, it was a very real, not just a figurative, but a very real barrier. And I was always aware of it as a kid. And I always felt like I needed to do the best I could to get through that door, right? Literally get out of that kitchen into the dining room and literally get a seat at the table. And so I think that's honestly that feeling of being out of place, that feeling of not belonging, that feeling that is really accentuated in a hot Chinese restaurant kitchen on a Friday night when you're 11, 12, 13 years old, that made a huge impact on me. And I think that motivated me to run for office. Let me fast forward to now, because Gary talked about all the reasons why it's important that we get a seat at the table. But I think sometimes we say that so much that we should be full partners in the democratic experiment, that we should have a seat at the table, that our voice needs to be heard. And sometimes we say it so much, I worry that it loses meaning. And we don't quite understand why it's important that Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, and in particular Chinese Americans, really participate, and why diversity and our representation is important. Why does representation matter? And I think it's become so clear in the last couple of years. It's because of moments like right now, when literally Chinese Americans in major cities, including New York City next door to me, including places in Connecticut, Chinese Americans have a target on our backs. We're literally being assaulted in the streets and on subways. And who's going to speak up for us if there is nobody in a position to do so that will be heard, right? In a position of authority to do something about it. You got Michelle Wu as the mayor of Boston. That is a huge step forward for our community, confronting this hate. I call the national convening of attorneys general using the Attorney General Alliance as a platform. We call the National Convening Against Anti-Asian Hate. That wouldn't have happened if I weren't Attorney General. And that's why it's so important that people like Allan and people like Gary, maybe we'll convince Gary to run again, and people like Grace Mung and others across the country, Michelle Wu, we need people like them in positions of authority and influence where they can actually do something, particularly in moments like this, to protect our community and to make sure that we're cared for, that law enforcement focuses on protecting our community and people in our community.
My next question is one it's kind of a complex question. It's difficult to answer, which is, why is it, do you think, the two of you think, that Asian Americans are underrepresented? And I know it's a complicated thing because it's not just discrimination. It's not just, it's a whole bunch of things. So by the way, you know, the two of you are Democrat and Republican. So now, since you both grew up with Chinese restaurants, you don't reach across the aisle, you reach across, you know, the kitchen table, right?
Lazy
to reach
Susan.
out to you, right? So what's your own personal view as to why it's, you know, Asian Americans are underrepresented in all these different, you know, pockets of politics? And I'll let whoever wishes to speak first, I'll you know, please speak.
I guess I'll go. We could talk about this question for hours, and let's set aside the obvious, racism, stereotypes, right? We're allegedly not leaders, right? That we're not vocal, that we're too recent as immigrants, you know, obviously China bashing, xenophobia, fear of Chinese Americans, all of that scapegoating. Let's put that to the side because that's easy to identify. I think sometimes we have trouble as a community getting out of our own way. And we talk about empowering Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders in the political system and the democratic process. I don't think that we all understand what it takes. And maybe that's because people come from different political traditions. And when you come here as immigrants, you have to learn American democracy. I think that's also an easy excuse because so does everybody else. But I think that, you know, for people like me and Allan and Gary, this is a long slog. You know, you start on a local board of education, you start as a volunteer. I started in this as a commissioner on a local commission. Then I ran for the state legislature, and I've had a lot of ups and downs. I've had more wins than losses, but I've lost a good amount. And I think people expect, frankly, that unless you're running for president, it's not really worth engaging. And that's the wrong approach. And I think there are other communities, frankly, that have done more faster than this community. I'll be very candid. The South Asian community has been very successful in a very short period of time. And I think it's because we as a community, we think maybe that we don't rock the boat ourselves, right? We buy these stereotypes that we're not leaders. 2, that it's not a worthwhile enterprise. And 3, that we don't make the investments that it takes to go from being a school board member or a local volunteer all the way up. That takes decades. It doesn't just happen overnight. And I think some people in our community think, well, let us know when you're a United States Senator or a governor, because we don't have time, you know, for the first few rungs of the ladder.
Allan, your view? By the way, that's an interesting point of view, General, because in fact, it's so easy to blame other people for things.
Yeah.
And there's a tendency not to be honest about maybe some of the things that are self-created barriers and so forth. Allan, your comment?
Yeah, actually, I want to supplement a lot of what William said because it's absolutely true. But I want to take it home a little bit, even more to that personal level, because, as I was recounting that story about me wanting to get involved in politics way back when I first jumped into that council race. And, I'm sure William and the governors had this discussion with many candidates that approached them. When you first jump in, the most important thing is to make sure that you have the support and buy-in of your family, because they're part of that campaign as well. And I remember that first conversation I had with my mom. And remember, she was born, in China, came over from Hong Kong. I was a successful lawyer, actually working as the head of government relations for MetLife, for their property casualty company. And I remember my mom looking at me and goes, wait a minute, you just spent all this money becoming a lawyer. You got a great job. Why would you want to go into politics at this time and, be subjected to all that yelling, screaming? It's not going to be easy. You're my son. Why would you want to put yourself through that? And, it's the protective mom in her. But, this is something I felt passionate about doing, wanting to do, putting my skills to the test. And, it worked. It was successful. Not every campaign's easy because, William and I, like we, kicked off this, talked about when we kicked it off, our districts, our demographics within this, our population here isn't heavily Asian American, never mind Chinese American. So it's not like we're coming from San Francisco. So there is a lot of work, a lot of effort. But, when you're successful and you can, break that initial barrier, and I was proud to be the first Asian American elected in Rhode Island, but, that can't stop there. We've got to overcome a lot of those mindsets that my mom had, because what's funny about it to this day, I'll go over for Sunday dinner, so I still got to go take care of mom and have Sunday dinner with her. But when I do, she's asking me questions like, oh, I saw you on this channel. And I'm like, this is a cable access channel, watching the city council meeting or watching, me on this channel. I'm like, wait a minute, for the woman that was very fearful of her son jumping into politics, now you can't get her away from the television trying to find out what's going on. A lot of it is also overcoming that initial fear and hurdle within your family, getting that support, because that is critically important, because you're going to have that initial foundation to move forward. Because William's right. I've been in the same boat that William's in, and I'm sure the governor too, where sometimes those challenges, you hit road bumps, but if you have the strong foundational support system and you continue building it up, that's how you continue to succeed, and not let, those barriers, be too much that you can't overcome, and just keep trying, because it's tough to be the first. But once that first is broken and that ceiling, bamboo ceiling's been kicked open, I want to see, just like William and the governor, more candidates coming in, more people getting involved, because this is truly public service. And if you're not at the table, you're going to be the dinner, and you don't ever want to be in that role.
Yeah. By the way, Allan, what did you tell your mom when she said, why are you doing this? And how long did it take her to forgive you? 5 years, 10 years, 12 years?
No, it worked out. But fortunately, my dad was very supportive, talked her off the ledge about, getting involved, because he saw coming over that there was a need, a role that, to be filled. And he also knew I had a big mouth and was always willing to be an advocate. And that's what we have to be. And I don't, that's why we're here in a bipartisan manner, to encourage others, to not be afraid to, be that voice for others, because we need it more so than ever now.
By the way, it took my parents 3 years to forgive me for not going to medical school. So it took a while, but they eventually, got over it. William?
Well, that was never in the cards for me. I wasn't good enough at the math and the science, but I wanted to do Allan one better. So when I was in the legislature, I was chairman of the Judiciary Committee, and our hearings would be broadcast on our local cable, Connecticut version of C-SPAN. And so when you're a legislator, you can't always stay in one hearing. You might have 3 hearings going on at the same time, even if you're the chairman. So I would leave to go to another hearing, and I might go get lunch, or go have a meeting, and I would get a text message from my mother, and she would say, "You've been gone too long. your chair has been empty. Go back to your chair. You have to chair that meeting."
Now,
Thanks, Mom.
my next question is actually, it's some kind of a subtle question in a sense. Now, both of you have a history running for office where you had to get voters to vote for you and so forth. But there's a whole list of jobs at different levels where you're appointed. So, and I know you have lots of friends who have been appointed to different positions. Gary Locke was appointed to be a Commerce Secretary. He wasn't elected to that. What's the difference? In other words, how does it feel different? How is it different in terms of the experience or what it's like, so forth, to be appointed as an Asian American versus running for office in an elected office? Allan, do you have a view?
Yeah, sure. Absolutely. No matter how you get involved, whether it's through an appointment, running for office, or even just supporting candidates, it's important to get involved, because if you're there supporting someone from an ideological perspective, aligns with you, or sitting on an important board or commission, like the governor indicated, we're always looking for good people that bring a fresh, diverse perspective to the table. Before I was elected mayor, our former governor had appointed me as chairman of our governor's insurance council. In that role, I was sitting there making sure that as an industry, we're providing appropriate advice, to the governor about the financial services industry within the state and how we can continue to improve the jobs and economy within Rhode Island. So there are different ways that you can use your background and talents, whether it's through an appointment, to an important board or commission, to a position. Certainly when the ambassador, when he was in that role as ambassador, to China, that's critically important. But there's a lot of different ways to serve, and I encourage people, no matter what role that you're in, what comfort level too, is also plays an important part of it, because sometimes running for office isn't for everyone, but there are different other ways to kind of get involved.
General, office, pros and cons?
I have to agree with Allan. It's not for everyone. And so while we both encourage people to run for office and engage in that way, you have to want to do it. And it takes a lot of sacrifice. The pay is not very good. There's a lot of scrutiny and criticism, a lot of it unfair. I still routinely check my Twitter feed, receive unwarranted, racist, hateful attacks because I'm a Chinese American, and nobody signs up for that, but nobody is surprised either that I get that. So running for office, raising money, knocking doors, making speeches, doing debates, that's not for everybody, but it is critical. Appointed positions are incredibly important and in many ways just as important. And Governor Locke has done both. But I think Governor Locke would agree that probably some of his most consequential service was when he was in charge and when he was able to set the agenda. And as a governor, he was able to do that unlike any other person in the state of Washington. And I think that that's a huge distinction. And if you run for office, particularly executive office, you will have the opportunities to set an agenda in a way that someone who's appointed, or frankly, who is a legislator, will not have the ability to set an agenda. And if you really care about advancing not just the interests of Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, but the interests that we share with other people, right? And that includes economic justice, right? Opportunity, law enforcement support, all of that, investments in education, all of those priorities that we all share, you can really only do that when you're in an elected position and you can set the agenda.
Now, General, you sort of may have peeked at the next question because you started to get into it, which is what are the candid pros and cons of being in public office? Now, this is very important because I know you have a lot of positive things, and if you didn't like what you were doing, you wouldn't have done it. But to be fair to the audience, I think it's important for them to see both sides of the coin, because you want to make sure, when I hire people, one of the things I always say is my goal is that after you work for a month, there are no surprises, either positive or negative. In other words, you really felt that you got an even information, both sides about it. So if you looked at that ledger and said, what are the candid pros and cons about being in political office that you would want someone to have told you, or you want the audience want to know in making their own decision, right? About whether to get into, political office. What would those be?
Well, the pros are obviously, well, maybe it's not obvious, but you can do extraordinary things for people. And so just in the past year, I was able to play a central role in the settlement negotiations with Purdue Pharma and the Sackler family, and to produce a $6 billion national settlement, and to cause the Sacklers to sit there while victims and survivors told them directly how they've destroyed their lives and impacted their communities. It is incredibly gratifying, personally, and rewarding, but also impactful to the families in Connecticut that I serve, that I was able to do that. I've been involved in landmark anti-gun violence legislation, for example, in Connecticut, and I know that saved lives. And I can't do that candidly as a lawyer in private practice. Those are the pros. The cons, I've already talked about the cons. Money, criticism, fair and unfair scrutiny, sacrifice, time away from family and children, and my wife and my family. But let me just say something, though. I think those sacrifices are overstated. And I remember having a conversation with a Filipino American doctor who said, "William, I don't know how you do it. How do you do with all the backbiting and the scheming and the backstabbing and the politicking?" And I said, "What do you mean?" He's like, "Well, I just couldn't do it. That's why I'm not in politics." I said, "Doctor, don't you work in a hospital?" And he said, "Well, yeah." And I said, "I can't think of a more political place than a hospital, or an investment bank, or a law firm, right? Or an insurance company. And the truth is, if I wasn't doing this, sure, I'd be making a heck of a lot more money, maybe at a partner, at a major law firm in New York, God willing. But the truth is, that would also be hard. I'd still be billing 3,000 hours a year. And, when the run up to partner, I wouldn't see my kids, and you have to, bring in business, and you have to, there's a political game, in a big institution like that, or a partnership about, who's in power and who's not in power. So, I think in any profession in which you're trying to be successful, make an impact, and be a leader, it's going to be hard.
Okay. Allan?
But a lot of the hard is outweighed by the good that you can do. William talked about some of the examples, and even with me taking, our second largest city from that financial, almost near bankruptcy state to one of the top 50 cities to live in America. And you see that transformation of building up, the city, working with developers as you change that landscape, working to solidify the city's finance, stabilizing our police officer and firefighters pension plan. That good really outweighs the hard. But let's not be kidful, because there are a lot of hards that are thrown and obstacles thrown in front of you, especially if you're, Asian American, Chinese American, because there are a lot of stereotypes that still get thrown at you. In fact, I'm just thinking back to my first race for mayor. I'll never forget the local Cranston paper on the weekend just before the election, they made a joke. It misfired badly, but the headline read, "Oh, voters have a choice. Will they go for Italian or Chinese?" Boiling down, the two candidates for the mayoral office, basically into food choices. And, you sit there going, really? But fast forward that, to 20 years later, when I'm one of my runs for governor, an individual didn't like one of the policy decisions that I was putting out there, decides to take my lawn sign, put it around a noose, and hang it from a tree outside in his front yard where a lot of the neighborhood kids were going by every single day. And whether he knew or not about the symbolism of a noose, especially for Chinese Americans, African Americans throughout history, that's some of the stuff that you will encounter, depending at the levels. It's not like that at all levels, but that is some of the hard realities that I faced. And I know William has faced that because, we're friends. We've talked about a lot of this stuff, or even governing. When you're governing, I had someone, because I was making difficult decisions. And when you get into office and you're on the verge of bankruptcy, you have to make tough decisions. 4 a.m., someone drove to my house, knocked out the storm window on my door and took off. You're seeing Michelle go through that in Boston, where daily, they're picketing outside of her home. Right now in this day and age, it's, we all live in a world where technology is wonderful, but it's also an inhibitor too, because, it's easy for many individuals to be keyboard warriors anonymously. And, you're putting yourself out there, not just in policy when you're governing, but when you're running for office. That's a lot to think about. But one of the things I do want to encourage people, because William, and the governor, can attest to it too. It's not easy, but when you get in there, you're the one setting the agenda. You're the one setting the policy. You're the one being the advocate, not just for the policies you believe in, but for your community. And you can better so much of not only your backyard, the state, the country, or even the globe.
But it sounds like, though, really each person has to take a hard look at themselves and say, what's the ledger look for me? If you don't have a passion for helping other people and so forth, then the plus is not as big a plus. If you're very sensitive about people doing nasty things and so forth, the con could be greater for you than for someone else. So I think you're right about the pros and cons, but the most important thing for all of you who are watching is take a look at yourself and be honest about what you're like, right? And what's important to you and what you can tolerate. And if you're a super private person, well, even if you really want to help the community, maybe being a politician is not a good thing. The next question is kind of an interesting question because I don't think it's asked very often. And that is, to get elected office, you've got to run, right? You got to run, and the skills and the task and the experience of running for office and raising money and meeting with people and so forth. And then there's being in office, right? Which is a totally different experience, right? So for the two of you, one, when you were running and as you had different offices, make that distinction, which is the skills and the experience of running versus being in office. And to what extent, how did you get the knowledge and the training to be effective in office, right? Because I got to tell you, being a lawyer at a law firm doesn't necessarily prepare you for being mayor of Cranston, Rhode Island, or being attorney general, right? It's a different kind of job. So that movement from running for office to being in office, what were the things that helped you figure out how to be effective, and what was really different about that transition?
Well, for me, a lot of just life experiences that we've gone through. William knows the drill. Growing up in that Chinese restaurant, you learn the value of hard work and not being afraid to, roll up your sleeves to do any jobs within that restaurant. And that's the same can-do attitude that I take, in that role as mayor, because it's difficult sometimes, and you have to learn to make sure that you get good advice. When we kicked off, we were talking about mentors and people, surrounding yourself with good people that could be a good sounding board, because you don't want individuals that are just yes people. Yeah, you're doing the best thing. So making sure that you have a good core group of people with you, as you're governing, especially in areas that might not be within, your area of expertise. There's a reason I chose the law. I just like William. I wasn't good with, engineering, and I was horrible with geometry. But when you get in there as mayor and you're, dealing with public works issue, you better make sure you have a solid public works director that's a PE that can fill you in. So there are differences between making sure that that role that you have, having the right resources around you to help complement the decision making you're doing, having a good mentor, CEO type. And I've got a great friend who's the CEO of Old Sturbridge Village out in Massachusetts. He and I, bounce things back and forth, the good and the bad. But it's also different because you're still, in a sense, while you're governing, also thinking about the campaign cycle too, because that's always there. That's always part of, that life too, because in order to be able to govern for a longer period of time, you're going to have to get reelected. So it all comes together, but most importantly, at all levels, you have to have the right team around you, right resources, and not just yes people.
Yeah, in fact, when I think across many of these webcasts that we've had over the last 2 years, probably one of the most common thing that's been mentioned is the importance of having a mentor. And that if you don't, one, you don't have someone who can help you succeed and help you be connected to the right people. But the other is you don't have access to knowledge that otherwise, someone's had from having already been through the experience. So I'm glad you mentioned that, Allan, because that's very important. And actually, Asian Americans generally don't think of mentors the same way that other ethnic groups do, right? And it's very, very important. So, General, your view on this thing about the transition to actually, governing, what was it like, and how did you make it work?
I couldn't agree more about mentoring, and maybe we could talk about that a little bit more. But, obviously, when you run for your first office, you're basing your knowledge and experience on your private sector experience. And I'm a huge believer, first of all, in cumulative experience and making sure that you, at every step along the way, know you're learning and developing, right? And focus on what you've learned. So before I went to the legislature, as a lawyer, I had developed skills, and I was very conscious of it, developed skills of being on my feet. I was effective with clients. And I was also effective at advocating for myself. And that's what a campaign is. It's advocating for yourself. And there's one stereotype that Asian Americans, in particular Chinese Americans, maybe we fall into, is that we don't advocate for ourselves. And there are a lot of reasons for that. We could talk about that for hours, but being an effective campaigner is being able to say why I'm good and why you should choose me. And you don't have to run for office to need to master that skill. If you want a job in a hospital or an investment bank or the university, you want to be a professor, you got to advocate for yourself. Once I got into office, it really became cumulative. My experience as a legislator taught me about all of state government, all the different nooks and crannies, how the process works. Then I became chairman of the banking committee and then chairman of the judiciary committee, where I had oversight for our state's legal system. So you pull that all together, after 12 years, I had been trained to be the chief legal officer of the state of Connecticut. And it was only because I had that cumulative experience of being in legislature, of chairing those committees, of being a lawyer in private practice, that I was able to put that all together. And by the time I ran for AG, I was ready. And I think, maybe I would have run for it sooner if I'd had an opportunity, but I wouldn't have been as ready as I was then. Excuse me.
By the way, I want to tell you a short story. I'm actually really surprised that the two of you didn't say that the key to your success was your experience in the family restaurant.
Well, we already said that.
You know,
we already said that.
And I'll tell you a very short story, and it's a Committee 100 story. I was co-chair of the New York annual meeting and gala in 2019. And one of our speakers was Bill McDermott, who at that time was the CEO of SAP, huge software company, global, whatever. And someone asked a question, said, oh, you know, when you grew up, your family had a deli. And as a joke said, what skills have you, from your experience with your family deli, did you transfer to becoming a successful CEO of SAP? He then spent 10 minutes explaining all the things that he learned while he was working at the deli that helped him become CEO of SAP. So which kind of surprised the person who asked the question, because they thought of it as a little bit as a joke, but I suspect that's true, right?
It's not a joke. And if I may, this is a really important point. One of the stereotypes that angers me the most is that we're not leaders, we don't rock the boat, that we're not aggressive, we're not tough, right? And you know, when you grow up watching your parents go 7 days a week, 15 hours a day, pounding the rock every single day, no fear. They came to this country. My dad had 57 cents in his pocket when he got off the Greyhound bus. Like, they didn't have time to think about whether they were leaders or not, or whether they were going to rock the boat. They just had to make it happen.
Mm-hmm.
And they did. And that's the most valuable lesson I learned from that restaurant, which is, you know, don't tell me we're quiet or meek or, you know, afraid to stick up for ourselves, or we don't rock the boat. I watched my parents do it for, you know, years and years in that restaurant. And that inspires me to this day.
Yeah. Allan, your comment?
Same here, because that restaurant that, you know, I was a part of, same story, 7 days a week. The only time that my parents closed was, you know, Christmas and Thanksgiving. But, you know, it's the same type of inspirational story that we all share, because whether it's the restaurant, laundry, or whatever, you know, industry our parents came, many of them, you know, really came here with nothing but, you know, the opportunity that was presented that they chose and that they worked hard to, you know, overcome. And they did it in their own way. Because William's right, it is so frustrating right now, not just in public service, but in many industries, you know, the stereotypes that are used against us. I've heard it, and I know William's heard it because, you know, two of us talk when we're on that campaign trail. Oh, he's not aggressive enough. Oh, he's not this, he's not that. I can tell you, I'm a fighter. And I know William is too. We will stand up for what is right, but we just do it in our own way. You know, I've gotten more success, you know, during the 12 years as mayor, doing it my way, you know, sitting across the table, hammering things out, you know, with facts, with data, you know, and that, a lot of that is the experience we had in the restaurant, where you're dealing with customer service, dealing with people on a daily basis, dealing with money on a daily basis. Those are those life skills and values that are instilled in you from day one that translate to not only just public service, but any job, any career that you choose.
So the last question I have for our two panelists is, as I'm sure you know what resources are available, whether it's nonprofits or training things and so forth, that are helpful to Asian Americans. Are there any that you would like to just cite that the audience should be aware of, the resources that are, you know, that might be available to help them either run for office or succeed?
Yeah, one I'd like to throw out, there are a lot of great organizations out there, and that's how William and I met. You know, William talked about almost over 15 years ago, we sat on a panel. I think it might have been for APACS or
It was APACS.
APACS.
Oh yes, APACS, right.
Yeah, so, you know, it was a training, and that's, you know, one of the organizations, but there are a lot more out there, you know, that can help develop leaders, whether it's a national organization like APACS or, in the legal field, there's KPAL or other organizations that are helping try to get the next generation of leaders trained so that they know what they're getting into. But for me, I think there needs to be even more. One of the things that I'm seeing that I find as a lack of resources is a continuous network, like an organization that brings forward all the networks that can help out candidates, especially, that look like us, come together for financial resources, for, help on media, help on, getting even just the simple basics of your campaign up and running. I think that's the one thing I'd like to see, us develop nationwide.
Yeah, that's elusive, and other communities do it better. So I agree with Allan. I think, just to go back to the mentoring point, it's really important to develop a relationship with a local mentor who has a type of experience that can help you if you want to serve, if you want to take a particular route, either as an appointed or an elected. And except for Gary and Secretary Mineta, there are very few mentors that look like us. And so most of my immediate mentors in my state are white males. I was very fortunate to have a number of mentors who invested in me, protected me, created opportunities for me. I think I don't know if intentionally or not, understood that it's a two-way street, right? It's not just
Right.
What can you do for me, Mr. Mentor?
Yeah.
It's, it is a relationship where you give as much as you take. But I was very lucky that the mayor of Stamford, Connecticut became my mentor, and then he became the governor. And, it's been a really helpful relationship for a very long time.
Yeah, and in fact, that's an important point that you're making, which is the mentors don't have to be Asian American, right?
No.
In fact, if you just said, I only want a mentor as Asian American, you won't have a long list of people to choose from. But I do want to just end with one comment about what's Committee 100 is trying to do. Last July, we had and I will ask Gary to make closing comments, which your perfect timing on turning your video back on. But last July, we did something unusual, which was we got all these people together, leaders from Ascent, from LEAP, from all so forth, and a lot of the people who had been attendees of these events and younger people. And we got them together in a virtual ballroom. And the title of the event was, What Can We Do Better? And the mission was to come up with ideas of things, a list of things that we could do that are action-oriented that would improve the situation with regard to the career ceilings. And out of that, came 25 ideas. And by the way, we had discussion groups and discussion leaders at each table, and they had to come back to the podium with 2 or 3 ideas from their table. We ended up with 25 really terrific ideas of things that are actionable. And one of them came from Maylee Tom, who's a Committee 100 member, who said, look, and her table agreed, look, in California, she helped to start this training program for candidates who are running for office who are Asian American, and then to help them be successful once they're elected. But as the general said, a lot of other groups have national organizations, other ethnic groups, but the Asian Americans don't. So one of the ideas is, how do we create some training things and programs? And this is something that Committee 100 could do in collaboration with other people that are resources to people who are thinking about running for office anywhere in this country. And that's one of the things on our list that we're going to try to do. I'm going to turn it over to Gary to have the last word and the closing comment.
Well, I just want to thank Peter again for hosting this career ceilings series of podcasts, and just really fascinating topics and really great speakers. And I'm really, I was just so inspired to hear from Allan and William in terms of their own career paths and their common intersections as well. I wish that when I was running for office, there were more Asian Americans in elected positions throughout the United States that I could have turned to And I'm just glad that Norma Netta and so many other people were role models for me and provided advice. Congressman Matsui and obviously Senator Inouye from Hawaii. Those are all inspirations. I just want to echo what both Allan and William have indicated. Just getting involved. Each community is different and different boards and commissions. And I noticed from some of the questions, what type of boards and commissions should people join? Well, join one that is of interest to you. I mean, that's the best thing. I mean, you don't want to join or be part of a board or commission that you have absolutely no interest in, because you're not going to do a very good job. You're not going to have much meaningful impact or input, and you won't really get recognized. So choose one that is of interest to you, whether it's in education, public safety, economic development, the environment, what have you, or senior citizens or medical care. So just participate. And it is from that, you can learn about the political system. You can kind of understand who the various players are. You can then figure out where you want to go, whether you want to run for a school board or city council or something else, or state legislature, or be in an appointed position. As William indicated, appointed positions can be just as impactful. But obviously elected positions, and certainly the executive branch, if you're able to be that person who makes the final decision, you can really have a great deal of influence. Let me just say that so many of the policies that I worked on benefited from my experience, or I brought my immigrant experience and observations to the table. And that immigrant experience, or understanding the trials and tribulations of immigrant families, made me a better public servant, and made me more sensitive to the issues of the Asian American community. And certainly my training as a lawyer brought a different lens. And so each of us have different expertises that we can bring to the table. And while there are many people who could equally do the job, who could get elected, but no one else has the unique set of experiences and perspectives that each of us can bring to the table that can help shape the policies that are before us, whether it's Allan in Rhode Island or William in Connecticut, and his experience in Connecticut, and Allan in Rhode Island. Those are not replaceable. They're not interchangeable. And so each of us has a unique opportunity to be at the table helping set the policies that affect all of us. And because we have faced so much hardship and discrimination from both Democrats and Republicans, quite frankly, the vitriol against Asian Americans and Chinese Americans today is coming from all sides of the political aisle, from the presidents under President Trump, to the members of Congress, to the governors and members of the state legislature. So this is not, the discrimination that Asian Americans and Chinese Americans have faced, starting with the Chinese Exclusion Act, limiting immigration to the United States, the alien land laws that prohibited Asians from even owning land in the United States, and it wasn't repealed until almost the early 1950s in many states. I mean, we have continued to face these issues of being portrayed the perpetual foreigner by so many different political groups and businesses and corporations all throughout our tenure here. And it's only with constant vigilance, having more people who are visible to the American public, can we change that perception of Asian Americans. And only by having more people at the table can our issues, and even simply our ethnicity and our contributions to America and our communities, be taken more seriously. So I'm just so proud of what Allan and William have done, and many of our other AAPI elected officials, whether it's in San Francisco, New York City, Boston, Chicago, Florida, Texas, state of Washington, all over. We have much to be proud of, but we have much more work to do. Yeah. And so we've got to get politically involved.
And I think Gary's point about at the end of the day, it has to overlap with something you care about. If you don't care about it and it doesn't have meaning for you, then it's not going to work. And just like this, this Asian American career ceilings thing, I started it because it bothered me, right? And so I said, is there something I can do within my scope of power, or whatever, that would really help? But I want to end with one comment actually from something that Gary said, which I thought was really wonderful. I remember I talked to him about when he ran for governor of Washington State, why he thought he won. And he said, there are two things. And Gary, I don't know if you remember this, and if I'm misquoting you, you can correct me. He said, one, I brought a different perspective because I was with an immigrant family. But the other was so many of the things that were a challenge for Asian Americans and Chinese Americans in the state of Washington were also challenges and concerns of the general voter population. And so I built bridges. I made sure I wasn't the enemy, but I was a common friend, right? And I remember that, Gary, you said that, because if all I said was I'm, Chinese American family, all these voters wouldn't relate to things I cared about. So I think that's the other part of it, which is, yes, it's important that Asian Americans succeed in politics and so forth, but we have to stay connected with the rest of the world too, as we succeed, other ethnic groups and the general population. So I want to just, again, thank you. This has been this is going to be one of my favorite webcasts. And I'm really, really pleased that we got these two wonderful panelists. And Gary, thank you for your welcome comment. And I want to thank all of you for being on. But I also want to thank the audience, because we had a very big audience. And by the way, generally the number of people watching goes down over time. There has not been a single reduction in the number of people on. So you obviously you said something that captured the imagination of the audience. So thank you very much. Thank you all, and thank you for attending.
Thanks, everyone.